Welcome. So this month we're featuring The Winter Warriors by Olivier Norek, out with Open Borders Press. And we have a representative from Open Borders Press here tonight, which is very exciting. It's very beautifully translated by Nick Caistor, who's a wonderful, he's a veteran translator. Specialises usually actually in South American literature, but he's done all kinds of books in French too. So it's based on the conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union, known as the Winter War. And this was just before World War II broke out. So Norek, he actually draws on, though it's a novel, he draws on genuine battles and hardships. And he apparently did a lot of research on the ground, did he? And also so the book, there's a lot of battles, but you also there's the brothers in arms, there's a group of men who are very close. And one of them is this legendary sniper who's absolutely incredible. He never misses a Russian. He becomes known as the White Death? Yeah, yes. The White Death. So you really get a feel of the freezing conditions. But of course the Finns win out. So there's a great feeling of history replaying itself now in terms of Ukraine. And so what's interesting is Norek, actually he was a former cop in the inner city around Paris. I think was he around Paris? Anyway, he's written a lot of crime novels, thrillers with works adapted for Netflix. But this book's done incredibly well. It's got lots of prizes. It's got the Prix Jean Giono, the Prix Renaudot des Lycéens, the Prix Le Mans Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's been a fine list for prizes and all the rest of it. So now, who has read it? Who has comments? Who has things to say? Over to you. For example, what particularly struck you, stayed with you, say, about the book?
I think that you really do feel the cold. In a lot of war stories, everything feels quite hot, especially lately. Mm-hmm. You're over in the Middle East or you're in rural France, but in Finland, there's this one scene where our sniper, Simo Heiha, comes up on this group of Russians around a campfire that's burned out. Oh, yeah. And his team says, shoot them, and as they get closer, they realize that the Russians' fire had burned out and that as a consequence, the whole lot of them had frozen to death just where they were sitting. So they're still sitting up.
Frozen statues.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
What year was the book set in? Sorry, because I'm not...
This is the 39-40?
Okay.
Is it? Yes, 39.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me look.
1939-40.
I think it was.
Ended
in March 1940.
With the victory of the Finns.
Yes, and that's just before the World War II kicked off, before the Nazis. I'm just trying to remember.
1938 is World War II, isn't it?
Well, it's when they invaded France in 40, didn't they? They were. Who did they first? They invaded
1913.
Poland, wasn't it?
And then we declared war on them, but then we didn't really kick off.
But then,
and that was part of the reason why no one wanted to help the Finns too much, because they knew that they were going to need every soldier.
Every soldier for their own defence. That's right.
Every gun. Yeah.
Did they know that the Russians were going to be their allies because they wouldn't want to go to war with a future ally? The Russians.
Well, that's an interesting point.
I don't think anyone really knew what the Russians were going to do at that point.
No, certainly. Yes, actually, I wonder. That's an interesting point. It's true. Though I think everyone was if you look at the history, there's a sort of mistrust of Russia generally.
Yeah.
But there's also the friendship between Simo. They all are recruited from around same villages, so they know each other. So there's a sort of bond. Whereas also you get this feeling that Russians, they just come from everywhere and anywhere. And there's that idea that there's this bond that's so important that helps them win and stand strong, really.
It was part of Mannerheim, who was the field marshal.
That's right.
Who was running this war. It was explicitly a part of his strategy that if you're fighting for your brothers, for the people you grew up with, then you're going to be reminded at every turn, every battle, that you're fighting for your home and your countrymen.
And your village and your neighbours. And
your little farm, yeah.
And then there's a sort of vague love interest. There was a woman from one of the villages who's one of the nurses. There's this sort of vague flirtation, but it never sort of adds up to much, actually. But how much do any of us know that this war even happened, actually?
But
None.
we didn't know about it before we published the book. No.
And
Exactly.
how significant was this war? Were there many fatalities? Was it...
Actually, at the end, there is something.
I think it was hundreds of thousands of
Wow.
Russians.
There were a lot of people.
Gosh,
Yeah. The Russians were rather ashamed of the whole thing, so they tried to
Because they
snuff it out.
lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we are. So there's all this thing also about the Russians. They're expecting honours and medals, and they're all just telling. Well, one of them bumped off. I can't remember anyway. So all the military archives are transferred to the Kremlin, kept under lock and key. So they're forgotten by Russian history. Shame at losing. So that's right. It was November 1939 to March 1940 that it happened. Yes. So 400,000 men in the Red Army were wounded. But the official figure was 350. The Finnish army lamented the loss of almost 70,000 men. It took 6,000 prisoners who were repatriated the day after the armistice. And then that's what's so awful, they could not tell their winter war either. 400 were executed as soon as they got home, and 4,000 were sent to the gulags.
Because they lost.
The Russians, because they lost.
They punished them.
Then one of the leaders became the object of rumours accusing him of being a German spy. Imprisoned and tortured, he defended himself, but then one eye was gouged out. And then he said what they wanted, and then he was shot. This is Beria. Beria, who was the head of... Oh, he was legendarily horrendous. He was a nasty piece of work. Beria was one of those real sadists. Wasn't he?
A secret police guy, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Loved torturing people.
Yeah, he enjoyed people screaming and dribbling, and I mean, there are some real sadists.
In the book, yeah.
Sadists, when you have a kind of monstrous leader, I always think it's like a magnet. All the sort of lead filings go zoom, all stick to the leader, and they all come out of the woodwork. And you think, ooh.
So what was the original language?
He wrote it in French.
He wrote it in French.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what did you make of it? Yeah.
I thought, I'm not a big reader of historical non-fiction, sorry. It goes without saying. But I found it very palatable in the sense that not palatable in terms of the story, like that.
It was great, yeah.
That sounds terrible.
Very well done. Yeah.
But in terms of how it's written, and it's made into this very beautiful narrative, and it's
Yeah.
very immersive. You can feel yourself there, like Clem was saying about the cold. It makes it more accessible, I think, this
Yeah.
part of history which is not so well understood or often presented. It's great that Norek has found a way to bring that to the reader without it being such a jump into, this happened then, this happened then. There's a lot of that, but it is all weaved into narrative. It's very beautiful. It's very well written, well done.
The translation, but I mean, Nick Caistor is, as a sort of veteran translator, it is unbelievably beautifully written, actually. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. I do think a lot of discussions about translation, and I mean, a good translator is actually a writer. And so this is a very good example of a beautiful translation.
See inside Simo's mind, the sniper. But
Simo, you get into the sniper's mind, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think he's the closest thing we have to a point of view on everything.
Right. Troubled. You said angry. Like, is he very troubled? And...
Well, he's angry because then his friends are killed.
Right.
So it's that whole thing about your brothers in arms,
Yeah.
and you're fighting with your mates, from your best mates, and then they're killed. So then you get very angry.
But at the start, it's all very joyous. They're sort of drinking together and
It's all on the jolly
and partying, and, everybody kind of gets this sense that something bad is about to happen.
Right.
But
And actually, there is a balance. I felt awfully sorry for the Russian High Command, because you sense early on that they are basically, obviously, going to get completely shafted. It is an awful feeling of the whole Stalinist. It's not going to end happily for you, particularly.
They sent masses of soldiers out,
Yeah.
under-equipped, untrained, unfamiliar territory, whereas the Finns knew every inch of the forest, how to use it, even in those conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
It was almost guerrilla warfare of the Americans invading Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But
Actually, that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is an amazing description when there's an amazing killer train. This train goes through the snow, and it just sort of mows down, guns firing from every direction. Spiral on Netflix was a very successful crime series.
Right.
So that was him.
Okay.
So he does. He's a TV. So it is very visual.
Okay.
Certainly, is it not very visual? Very total immersion.
Sounds
You're
great.
already in
I
it.
like
No,
the-
it is amazing.
The pacing is nice. It sounds like a couple of books that I've read where there's that passage where it's just like the pacing is just going higher and higher. And
Right.
you feel like it's actually happening around you.
Wow.
But I mean, I only found out about the book on Saturday from Kukla, so she she told me. So yeah, it's on the list.
There are a lot of battles, but they are very beautifully described. Yes, and I admit the certain points, the movements. I was like, good Lord, he's really studied the sort of who's behind what tree and which. There's all the topography, the lie of the land, the river, the sea.
Yes, those
So,
Nordic
you know,
countries are very
So there's
interesting.
the sea, and there are some lovely descriptions. Well, there is that here, the psychology of how are we going to
Yeah.
outwit.
All the different
Yeah.
places from
Yeah.
the Soviet Union at the time who really don't want to be there.
You're
They
right.
don't even
Yeah.
feel
It was like
welcome.
shades of, I'm afraid, obviously, shades of
Yes.
Ukraine. Russians are bringing in Koreans to
Right.
fight in Ukraine now, apparently. Cannon fodder. And there is then this whole Simo, this legendary character. He is extraordinary. But he was wounded and sort of
Yes.
nearly died, actually.
In the French edition, there was a photograph of him later in his life, which Christopher, the publisher, didn't want to put in, but he had most of his jaw shot off. And although he spent a lovely rest of his life, he went back to his farm, he got a couple of dogs, and he lived quietly with a very different kind of face.
Wow.
But that's right, he was they had to reconstruct him virtually.
Yes, yeah, he was horribly wounded. And here we only have a photo of him when he was very young. Simo Heiha Museum, which is in his old house. He's a national hero.
So do they celebrate him every year? Are the sort of celebrations Finnish? I suppose
amazing.
Finnish pride.
The thing that surprised me was that this book got translated into Finnish, and Olivier, the author, went to Finland for a tour. He had people coming up to him crying, the best book about the Winter War I've ever read, because apparently the Finns, it's still too close in their history. They don't want to talk about it, they don't want to write about it. I suppose after that they had the continuation war, so there's another trauma on top of this one.
Then it's interesting, like, it's had such success in Finland because you think, it's not long enough ago that they've wanted to write about it, but there's clearly a market for it, or they're clearly interested in it.
And the president of Finland last week, you know how you have your top 5 books?
It's fantastic, but how come do you think it's taken a French author?
They're all very reserved and off. They
Introverted.
need a
Yeah.
fiery Frenchman to come along.
Yeah, he's very charming and very charismatic indeed. So any other thoughts?
Even though The Winter Warriors was the first novel Olivier has written that isn't crime, I think that voice still comes through, and that Nick really has a perfect grasp of what Olivier is trying to say and how he wants it to be said.
Traditionally, and when I was working at a publisher, we were working, the author and the translator, there was a discussion, and that's fine. And there's a movement now in publishing. Oh, no, the translator you don't want to deal with the author at all. It's just my translation. I've had good experiences, but I do remember once having an incredibly rude writer, and I just thought, you unpleasant little shit. Because you really, no, don't be rude. I mean, I made a mistake, and mistakes happen. And, I'd sent queries, and that, I think, is what's important. It's not so much, of course, when you're translating, you're not in the head of the writer. So even the best translation or translator, I mean, I have read translators, there's 2 books that are very Parisian, very good translator, but she made mistakes. She got things wrong.
Right.
You have to.
Could he understand the language they were translated in?
Yes, and he'd done everything very carefully in the English, all the names, because he was going back to all these different mythologies and etymologies.
Right.
And
And
so
he felt it hadn't been just.
he must have been terrible to translate
Right.
for.
Right.
Because I think unless you were talking, you couldn't possibly pick up on
Yeah.
everything he was doing.
Right.
Oh, evenings
in the...
And I think it's Anne Goldstein. I can't
Oh, yeah.
remember
Yes,
her
Elena
name. Is it?
Ferrante, yeah.
She's so acclaimed, so she can't have had, too much of a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you never know what,
Yeah.
With Anna Ferrante specifically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's
Done all the Ferrante novels.
yes,
Yeah.
all at least the 4 in the
The big one, the
quartet.
first ones,
yeah,
yeah.
the Neapolitan novels.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Ferrante's and other ones that are, I think, just as good and
Yeah.
overlooked. I think it was called something like The Woman Abandoned.
Oh, the Days of Abandonment.
Days of
I really
Days
want
of
to read
Abandonment,
that.
yeah.
Oh my god, that's
Yeah.
visceral.
Yeah,
That's visceral.
really,
It's
yeah.
just-
That brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you all for listening to the BookBlast podcast of our book club discussion about Olivier Norek's The Winter Warriors. And thank you, Clem, from Open Borders Press, for joining us and giving us all manner of insights. Please do visit the BookBlast shop online at bookshop.org.uk if you'd like to get a copy and read it for yourself. It is a superb novel. See you next month.